Why do the kindest people seem to suffer the most? Why is it that you give your loyalty, your time, your honesty, your best, and somehow you still end up feeling abandoned, overlooked, or replaced? And then you look around and you see people with zero conscience, zero shame, somehow gliding through life like the rules don't touch them, while you're constantly at war with yourself. Nobody really told you why this happens. And honestly, a lot of people don't want you to understand it. Because the moment you do understand it, you stop being easy to control. So let me be clear. This isn't a soft, comforting lecture. This is a warning. A harsh truth. One you may have felt for years but never had words for. If you still believe being good automatically earns you fairness, I need you to pause right now, because you're not losing because you're not good enough. You're losing because you're playing a game you don't even realize you're in. And that's the worst position to be in, being a player who doesn't know the rules. Machiavelli never told you to become evil. That's the lazy interpretation people throw around. What he actually warned against is something way more dangerous than being bad. He warned against being naive. Because in the real world, the survivor isn't the nicest person. It's the person who understands timing. The person who knows when to speak and when silence is sharper. The person who knows when to be warm and when cold is protection. The person who can disappear without warning when the situation turns toxic. And if that offends you, good. That means you still have illusions left to burn off. Because if you're clinging to the fantasy that the world is fair, you're going to keep getting shattered in the exact same way. Over and over. Not because life hates you, but because the system rewards something different than what you were trained to offer. You were taught a script. Be loyal. Work hard. Keep your head down. Be polite. Don't cause conflict. Do the right thing. And you were promised, directly or indirectly, that life would eventually reward you. But nobody taught you how to survive betrayal. Nobody warned you that kindness, when it has no boundaries, becomes a currency other people spend. Nobody prepared you for what it feels like when you pour your whole soul into someone, into a job, a friendship, a relationship, a family dynamic, and then you get silence in return. That silence is brutal. It's not dramatic. It's not cinematic. It's just empty. You're sitting there holding the remnants of everything you gave, while the other person has already moved on like you were nothing. And that moment breaks people, because it forces you to face a truth you were never taught. Your goodness wasn't always appreciated. Sometimes it was simply used, not because you were weak, but because you believed the game was fair. And Machiavelli? He never believed in fairness, not as a rule of reality. To him, fairness is often just a bedtime story told to obedient people, so they'll stay compliant. Because fairness makes you wait. Fairness makes you tolerate. Fairness makes you keep giving one more chance. Fairness keeps you quiet. But the world isn't built on fairness. The world is built on leverage. And the painful part is this. You weren't betrayed because you were bad. A lot of you were betrayed because you expected loyalty in a world that rewards advantage. You expected people to be who they said they were, instead of who their incentives revealed them to be. And that's where it stings. Because you gave access. Access to your trust. Access to your time. Access to your emotional energy. Access to the parts of you that you don't show everyone. And some people didn't use that access with hatred. They used it with something worse. Indifference. They took what they could, and when it no longer served them, they detached like flipping a switch. Picture it like this. You're in a dark room, holding what's left of your effort, your loyalty, your patience, your sacrifice, and they're not even thinking about you anymore. You thought loyalty was a virtue. They saw loyalty as a tool. And that difference in worldview is exactly why good people get crushed. Because you follow moral rules in a world built on strategy. You think being real is enough. You think being consistent is enough. You think being kind guarantees safety. But the truth is, the world doesn't reward good. It rewards useful. It rewards valuable. And value isn't measured by how hard you work or how much pain you can tolerate. Value is measured by perception, by control, by timing, by what people believe about you. And I know that sounds cold, but stay with me. Because this isn't a call to become cruel. This is a call to become aware. Here's the brutal equation most people learn too late. If you are kind without boundaries, people will drain you. If you are loyal without leverage, people will use you. If you forgive without consequence, people will forget you. Not because everyone is evil, but because they can. Because the system rewards what it can extract. And your innocence, if left unguarded, becomes your cage. Your softness, if not protected, becomes your grave. You were taught to avoid conflict, to stay polite, to swallow your voice when something felt wrong. But let me ask you something straight. Where has that silence gotten you? How many times have you stayed quiet to keep the peace while your spirit was breaking in private? How many times have you swallowed your anger, swallowed your truth, swallowed your boundaries, and then told yourself it was noble? It wasn't noble. It was submission dressed up as morality. Machiavelli saw something people hate admitting. Nobility without power is often just performance. Suffering without strategy is just being trained to accept less. And if you don't learn how to protect yourself, people will keep taking, not always because they're monsters, but because the situation makes it easy. This is the pain of not knowing the rules. This is the pain of believing the system sees you. It doesn't. It sees your output. It sees your obedience. It sees how much you'll tolerate. And when you finally break, it replaces you. So if what I'm saying hits you deep, it's not because you're broken. It's because you're waking up. You're starting to notice the pattern. You're starting to realize your suffering wasn't random. It was the predictable result of being good inside a system designed to reward something else. And the moment you see the game, everything changes. Because now you can learn how to play it. Not as a pawn. Not as someone who begs for fairness, but as someone dangerous in a quiet way. A player who sees. A player who waits. A player who moves deliberately. Not for revenge. For balance. For self-respect. That's the real gift Machiavelli offers. Not cruelty for fun. Not manipulation for ego. Power. The kind of power that doesn't scream, doesn't plead, doesn't collapse under criticism. It just stands there unmoved, unshaken, unbothered whether the world approves or not. And this is where you begin. Not with anger, not with blaming everyone who used you, but with the truth. You were never taught how to survive. So now you teach yourself. And before we go further, I want you to sit with one question. If this pain was never personal, if it was systemic, what happens when you finally stop playing by their rules? Let's keep going, because this is where most people get uncomfortable. They dressed the whole thing up to make it sound noble. They told you kindness was a virtue. They told you politeness was power. They told you that if you just stayed generous, humble, and soft, life would eventually reward you. And look, I'm not saying kindness is bad. I'm saying unguarded kindness is dangerous. Here's the truth nobody spells out. Kindness without clarity is a trap. Kindness without boundaries becomes a weapon other people use against you. And kindness without awareness isn't virtue. It's submission dressed up as morality. They told you to do the right thing, but never explained who gets to define right. They said, turn the other cheek, but never taught you how to defend yourself. They glorified sacrifice, but never showed you who profits from it. And that right there is the game. Because when someone can convince you that your pain equals goodness, they can keep you bleeding while calling it character. Machiavelli saw through that. Not because he hated morals, but because he understood power. He understood that society doesn't reward kindness the way you think it does. It rewards usefulness. It rewards leverage. It rewards the people who understand the system and bend it quietly. And while you were helping everyone, nobody was protecting you. While you said yes to everything, people stopped valuing your time. While you gave second chances, they took third, fourth, fifth, because they learned you don't enforce consequences. This is a brutal lesson. Society doesn't respect the kind. It respects the strategic. The person who knows when to say no. The person who knows when to walk away. The person who knows when to give and when to withhold. You weren't trained to be strategic. You were trained to be agreeable. You were trained to avoid conflict. You were trained to be liked. But being liked isn't the same as being respected. And being respected isn't the same as being safe. You can be loved by everyone and still be used by all of them. Because people don't always treat you how you deserve. They treat you how you allow. Let that sink in. If you tolerate disrespect, you invite it. If you're always available, you become invisible. If you never set a boundary, they will push until nothing is left of you. And if you're hearing this and thinking, so I should stop being kind? No, this isn't about becoming cruel. It's about redefining kindness. Real kindness has a spine. Real kindness says, enough. Real kindness protects itself first, then gives from overflow, not emptiness. There is no virtue in being exhausted. There is no nobility in letting yourself be used. There's only silence, followed by regret. And the crazy part is, while you're still overthinking, am I being too harsh? Am I being selfish? They're calculating how far they can go before you snap. That's why Machiavelli would laugh at the idea that saying yes makes you a good person. Saying yes doesn't make you good. It makes you easy. A wise man knows when to appear kind. A wiser one knows when that kindness must end. Because fake morality is a prison. It keeps you apologizing for things you didn't do. It keeps you soft in situations that demand steel. So stop asking, what will they think of me? Start asking, why do I need their approval so badly? Kindness isn't approval seeking. Kindness is strength under control. So here's your new rule. Be kind, but unpredictable. Be generous, but selective. Be forgiving, but not forgetful. Be good, but never easy. Because in a world that trains you to sacrifice, one of the most powerful things you can do is stop bleeding for people who wouldn't give you a drop in return. That isn't cruelty. That's self-respect. And self-respect is where real power starts. Now, let's go deeper, because this next piece is where people lose their leverage without even realizing it. You've been taught that showing emotion is authenticity, that it's strength to cry, that it's brave to be vulnerable. And again, emotions aren't evil. Vulnerability isn't automatically weakness. But here's the brutal question. When has your vulnerability ever protected you in a negotiation? When has your honesty ever stopped someone from betraying you? When has emotional openness ever made a ruthless person suddenly become merciful? Exactly. Machiavelli didn't say emotions were bad. He said they were dangerous. Not because you feel them, but because other people can see them. And the moment someone sees your emotional patterns, they know where to strike. In the game of power, visibility is liability. Your anger, they'll provoke it. Your love, they'll leverage it. Your guilt, they'll weaponize it. And the rule is simple. Whoever controls their emotions controls the room. Whoever loses emotional control loses leverage. Now, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. You are allowed to feel everything. You are not allowed to reveal everything. Control is not suppression. Control is direction. It's taking the fire inside you and choosing where it burns. And more importantly, who it touches. Because the world trains you to react, to post, to rage, to explain yourself, to defend your identity. But reaction is a gift you hand your enemies. Silence, on the other hand, is a sword they can't block. They expect you to fall apart. They expect you to argue. They expect you to justify. They expect you to chase closure. So what happens when you don't? What happens when you just observe, unshaken, unfolding the situation like a strategist? Not like a victim, not like a pleaser, like someone cutting through illusions. That's when the fear shifts. It's no longer you fearing them. It's them questioning you. Because emotion makes you predictable, but control makes you terrifying. They don't know how much you see. They don't know what you're planning. They don't know where your line is. And that unknown is power. This isn't about becoming cold for the sake of it. It's about becoming untouchable. Because emotional discipline isn't the absence of humanity. It's the presence of clarity. And clarity is rare. Clarity is uncomfortable. Clarity is threatening, especially to people who survive by keeping you confused. The world will call you distant, aloof, arrogant. They'll beg for your reaction. They'll interpret your silence as weakness. Let them. You are not here to be understood. You are here to be effective. And effectiveness requires edge. Look at history. Real leaders didn't speak with trembling voices. They didn't explain every move. They mastered presence. They walked into rooms and shifted gravity, not with noise, but with restraint. Because emotion is loud, but power whispers, and that whisper cuts deeper than any scream. So the next time you're in pain, don't announce it. Harness it. Don't collapse. Convert. Because the person who stays calm in chaos becomes the person who cannot be broken. And if you've ever lost power because your emotions got exposed, then it's time to take that power back. Quietly, deliberately, completely. You've been taught that speaking up is strength, that expressing everything you feel is healthy, that silence means weakness. But Machiavelli understood something most people still get backwards. In the world of power, silence is not surrender. Silence is signal. Silence is calculation. Silence is controlled fear, directed outward instead of inward. Because silence makes people uncomfortable, and discomfort forces people to guess, and guessing is where power begins. The loudest person in the room is almost never the one in control. They speak to be noticed. They react to be respected. They explain because they want approval. But the truly dangerous person, they say very little. They let the room bend around their presence. They let others fill in the gaps with assumptions, curiosity, caution. And those gaps get filled with fear far more often than clarity. That is power. You think silence is passive. It's not. Silence is one of the most active tools of dominance. It demands attention without asking. It shifts dynamics without movement. It forces people to reveal themselves while you reveal nothing. Let me be very clear about something most people struggle with. You do not need to explain your boundaries. You do not need to justify your standards. You do not need to verbalize every emotion to prove your experience is valid. Sometimes power is preserved by what you don't say, by what you withhold, by what you allow others to wonder about. Because the moment people know exactly what angers you, they can use it. The moment they know what you fear, they can control it. The moment they know your limits, they will test them. But when they know nothing, they move carefully. They speak softer. They hesitate. They don't assume you're weak. This is the genius of controlled silence. When you don't explain, they wonder. When you don't react, they project. When you don't chase, they question their own value. And questioning is where manipulation starts to fail. Because emotional manipulators thrive on predictable reactions. Anger, defensiveness, over-explaining, apologies. When you remove those reactions, they lose the map. They don't know where to push. They don't know what lever works anymore. Silence becomes your armor, your signal, your warning. The world expects you to break. It expects you to overshare, to vent, to post, to give everything away in words. But the king doesn't explain his moves. The general doesn't tell the enemy where the strike will land. And you, right now, are building your own kingdom. So learn this. When you're disrespected, don't argue. Withdraw. When you're underestimated, don't prove yourself. Observe. When they expect your reaction, disappoint them with silence. Because reaction often feels like strength, but it's usually weakness in disguise. Restraint, on the other hand, is unmistakable power. You don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to prove to be seen. You don't have to talk to be felt. You just have to be unshakable. And that starts with silence. The kind of silence that makes people question everything. What you know, what you want, what you're willing to do. That is the language of the powerful. Learn it, master it. Because the people who do don't get crushed by the system. They navigate it. They bend it. Now, let's talk about something even more uncomfortable. Because silence alone isn't enough. Machiavelli said something most people gloss over. It is not enough to be powerful. You must appear powerful. Because in this world, perception is reality. And whoever controls perception controls the game. People don't follow truth. They follow certainty. They follow confidence. They follow the illusion that someone knows exactly what they're doing. That's why you see incompetent people rise. Not because they're better, but because they understand image. That's why honest, capable workers get overlooked. Not because they lack skill, but because they don't know how to frame it. That's why lies told boldly often beat truths spoken timidly. Machiavelli understood something society doesn't like admitting. Most people don't want what's real. They want what looks real. They want coherence. They want confidence. They want something they can believe in without thinking too hard. So, if you don't shape how people perceive you, they will do it for you. And they will almost always shape it to your disadvantage. You think honesty speaks for itself. It doesn't. You think hard work guarantees recognition. It doesn't. Not unless it's presented through the right lens. Because influence isn't about being the best. It's about being believed. And belief is a performance. Now listen carefully, because this is where people misunderstand Machiavelli. Controlling perception is not lying. It's curation. It's strategic truth. It's understanding that how something feels is often more powerful than how it is. Say less, but say it better. Show less, but show it stronger. Don't just be competent. Be compelling. That means you stop oversharing. You stop exposing weakness before it is transformed into strength. You stop begging to be understood. Instead, you build a narrative so clean, so precise, that people want to believe it, because it gives them clarity, and clarity feels like safety. This is how leaders emerge, not from raw talent alone, but from controlled image. You must learn how to create space around yourself. Silence, mystery, uncertainty. Let people think you know more than you say. Let them wonder what you're planning. Let them fill the gaps with fear, respect, awe. Because once you control how people feel in your presence, you control how they act in your absence. Think of perception like armor. When it's built right, people hesitate before testing you, not because they know what you'll do, but because they don't. That hesitation is fear by design. That is respect without negotiation. If you're tired of being dismissed, this is where it changes. Control how you enter a room. Control your tone. Control your pace. Control your image. Make your presence say more than your words ever could. Remember this. People don't treat you how you are. They treat you how they perceive you. And perception can be engineered. Deliberately. Strategically. Without shame. Because this isn't about manipulation for ego. It's about survival. In a world that rarely rewards the honest, but consistently bows to the believable. You don't need to deceive. You only need to direct. Control the spotlight. Control the silence. Control the frame. Because if you don't, someone else will. And if they control how others see you, they control how the world treats you. Now we need to talk about loyalty. Because this is where a lot of people completely lose themselves. You were told loyalty is sacred. You were told to stand by your people no matter what. You were told walking away makes you weak, selfish, or ungrateful. But Machiavelli didn't romanticize loyalty, and there was a reason for that. He understood a truth most people avoid because it hurts too much to admit. Loyalty is rarely based on love. It's based on benefit. People are loyal to what serves them, not to what saved them, not to what sacrificed for them, not to what stayed when things were hard. You can bleed for someone and still be replaced, not because you weren't loyal enough, but because your loyalty stopped being useful. And in the real world, irrelevance is a slow death. We've turned loyalty into a moral badge, something pure and noble. But in power dynamics, loyalty is a transaction, a temporary contract. And like any contract, it lasts only as long as both sides benefit. The moment it stops paying off, it gets broken. Think about it. The employee who gave decades to a company, laid off in a single email. The friend you covered for, gone the moment your reputation was at risk. The leader who praised your loyalty, until someone cheaper or quieter came along. This isn't bitterness. This is pattern recognition. Loyalty without leverage is servitude. It's not admired. It's expected. And once it's expected, it's no longer valued. It becomes background noise. Something taken for granted. Something exploitable. That's why people say you've changed when you stop being endlessly loyal. What they really mean is this. You stopped being predictable. You stopped being convenient. You stopped being theirs. Machiavelli would tell you this plainly. Don't offer loyalty. Offer value. Make people want to keep you, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody wants to say out loud. People don't betray you for no reason. They betray you when the reason to stay becomes weaker than the reason to leave. So either give them a reason or give them distance. And never confuse familiarity with allegiance. Just because someone stood beside you doesn't mean they'll stand behind you. Just because they laughed with you doesn't mean they'll fight for you. Loyalty is not love. It's economics. This doesn't mean you become cold or cynical. It means you become clear. You start recognizing that real alliances are built on aligned interests, not shared history alone. You stop begging for loyalty. You start building influence. Because when you have power, real, quiet, strategic power, loyalty becomes a side effect. Not something you chase, not something you demand. People stay because leaving you would cost them more than staying. That's how loyalty actually works. Not through sacrifice, through significance. If you give too much for free, people forget its worth. If you offer unconditional loyalty, they test how far it goes. So become the kind of person people don't want to lose, not because you guilt them, but because what you bring is too valuable to replace. Be the person they can't afford to betray. And if they do betray you, you don't collapse. You don't beg. You don't chase explanations. You disappear. You withdraw access. You let silence do the damage. Because the moment you stop needing loyalty is the moment you start commanding it. That's when people realize something painful. They were never loyal to you. They were loyal to what you never made them earn. Now here's where everything shifts. You've seen what happens to the obedient. You've felt the betrayal, the silence after sacrifice, the absence of fairness. And now you're standing at a crossroads. Repeat the cycle or rewrite the rules. Because if you want to stop being crushed, you have to stop living like someone waiting to be saved. No system is coming. No boss is coming. No person who promised forever is coming. And that realization isn't a tragedy. It's freedom. Machiavelli never said life is fair. He said power is earned, not begged for. So build. Build a mind they can't manipulate. Build a presence they can't ignore. Build boundaries so clear they echo before you speak. This isn't about revenge. It's about reconstruction, about reforging your identity into something unbreakable. Start by studying the rules, not to obey them, but to understand how they work. Learn when to be visible. Learn when to disappear. Learn when to say less. Learn when walking away isn't weakness, but dominance. Because strength isn't always confrontation. Sometimes it's detachment. Sometimes it's being so grounded that chaos can't reach you. The world expects you to react, to panic, to fight for validation, to chase crumbs of approval. So don't give them what they expect. Withdraw your energy from places that don't deserve it. Starve the systems that feed off your compliance. And while they scramble for attention, you build leverage. Learn skills that can't be ignored. Create value that doesn't beg. Develop a presence that speaks before you do. You don't need to roar. You need to rise quietly, strategically, like a shadow that becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't arrogance. It's authorship. It's realizing your life was never meant to be lived by someone else's design. So, design your own. Set your standards. Enforce your space. Refuse to explain your evolution. The right people will adapt. The wrong ones will fade. Let them. Because Machiavelli understood something timeless. The lion survives by strength. The fox survives by cunning. But the one who blends both becomes untouchable. You don't discard your morals. You protect them with intelligence, with fire, with strategy. Because good intentions without protection are just invitations for exploitation. So protect them. Be generous, but guarded. Be open, but not exposed. Be kind, but calculated. Your softness was never the problem. Your lack of strategy was. And once you fix that, everything changes. Because here's the truth most people never fully face. In this world, goodness without strength becomes silence, and silence without presence becomes invisibility. But presence, backed by clarity, that's power. The kind of power that doesn't beg to be seen. The kind that doesn't ask permission. The kind that doesn't need applause to exist. Once you taste that, you don't go back. And when people start wondering how you changed, let them wonder. Because you didn't just survive, you rewired the rules. This was never meant to be a motivational speech. This was a wake-up call. Because no one told you the price of being blind. No one told you that in a world ruled by perception, loyalty, and silence, the kind-hearted often become prey. You were told being good was enough. You were told doing the right thing would protect you. You were told your pain meant something, that your sacrifices would come back around. But now you know the truth. They don't. Not unless you change. Not unless you stop waiting for justice and start creating your own terms. This isn't about becoming ruthless. It's about becoming responsible for your own power. It's about owning the space you've been shrinking yourself to fit into. It's about realizing something painful but freeing. The world never hated your goodness. It loved your compliance. Machiavelli didn't write for kings sitting on thrones. He wrote for survivors, for people who got tired of being used, for people who were done being stepped on, dismissed, and silenced. He didn't teach destruction. He taught endurance, with intention. He taught how to rise strategically, not blindly. How to speak only when silence has done its work. Because you don't have to become heartless, but you do have to become clear. Clarity is the antidote to manipulation. Presence is the death of exploitation. So ask yourself honestly, who benefits when you stay quiet? Who profits when you stay small? And what would your life look like if you stopped waiting for permission to take up space? This isn't the end of your story. It's the first page of a new script, written by you, played by you, defined by no one else. No more hoping to be chosen. No more bleeding for applause. No more confusing obedience with virtue. You've seen the lie. Now you choose the truth. Not to be feared, but to be free. So let me ask you one last question. Are you ready to become untouchable? If the answer is yes, it doesn't start with noise. It doesn't start with confrontation. It starts quietly. One thought at a time, one boundary at a time, one deliberate move at a time, because the world isn't going to save you. But you don't need saving anymore. You can write the story where you no longer wait for fairness, where you no longer explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, where you no longer give unlimited access to those who never earned it. And that moment, when you stop waiting to be rescued, that's the first real taste of power. Not loud power, not aggressive power, but grounded power. The kind that stays calm while others panic. The kind that observes while others react. The kind that moves when the timing is right, and not a second before. You don't announce it. You don't justify it. You don't ask for permission. You simply change, and let the silence do the explaining. That's how the kindest people stop suffering, not by becoming cruel, but by becoming aware, by becoming strategic, by becoming present, by becoming someone who can no longer be used without consequence. And once you reach that point, something strange happens. People start treating you differently, not because you demanded respect, but because they feel it. They sense the boundaries. They sense the restraint. They sense the weight behind your silence, and they act accordingly. That is real power, and it was always available to you the moment you stopped giving it away. Before we close this, I want you to slow down, not to reflect emotionally, not to spiral, but to see clearly. Because clarity is what this entire message was pointing toward. If you've stayed until the end, it means something inside you already recognizes the truth. You weren't unlucky. You weren't broken. You weren't too sensitive or too nice in some defective way. You were conditioned. You were taught a set of rules that sounded moral, safe, and honorable. But those rules were never designed to protect you in a world that runs on leverage, perception, and incentives. You were taught how to behave, not how to survive. You were taught to give, not how to guard. You were taught to endure, not how to position yourself. And when you live by those rules long enough, you start to believe the problem must be you. That if you just tried harder, gave more, stayed quieter, or sacrificed longer, things would eventually turn around. They don't. Not because life is cruel, but because systems don't reward intention. They reward outcomes. They reward advantage. They reward awareness. That's the part nobody tells you. And once you see it, something shifts permanently. Because real power doesn't come from becoming louder, tougher, or more aggressive. It comes from becoming awake, from realizing that not every emotion needs to be expressed, that not every truth needs to be spoken, that not every battle deserves your energy, from understanding that access to you is not a right, it's a privilege. You don't need to become a different person to reclaim your power. You need to stop bleeding in places that were never designed to heal you. The most dangerous transformation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't post updates. It doesn't explain motivations. It happens quietly, internally, and then externally through behavior. It happens when you stop reacting and start observing, when you stop justifying and start deciding, when you stop chasing approval and start enforcing standards, when you stop explaining your boundaries and simply acting on them. That's when the world begins to treat you differently. Not because you demanded respect, but because your presence now carries weight. People feel it when someone is no longer emotionally accessible on demand. They feel it when reactions disappear. They feel it when silence replaces explanation. And silence, controlled silence, creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates caution. Caution creates respect. That's the shift. You'll notice it in small moments at first. Conversations change tone. People hesitate where they once pushed. Some drift away without confrontation. Others suddenly behave better without being asked. Not because you scared them, but because you're no longer predictable. And predictability is what made you exploitable. You don't need revenge. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to win. You need composure. You need boundaries that don't negotiate. You need the discipline to let people misunderstand you without correcting them. Because the truth is this: people who benefited from your lack of boundaries will always dislike your clarity. Let them. Their discomfort is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to yourself, to your time, your energy, your direction, your future. Power is not about domination. It's about positioning. It's about choosing where you give access. It's about knowing when to speak and when silence does more damage than words ever could. It's about understanding that kindness without structure becomes self-betrayal, and generosity without limits becomes depletion. You can still be kind, but your kindness now has a spine. You can still give, but you give from surplus, not sacrifice. You can still care, but you no longer abandon yourself in the process. That's maturity, that's self-respect, that's power integrated, not performed. And here's the final truth most people never fully accept. The world didn't punish you for being good. It rewarded others for understanding the rules you were never taught. Now you know them, and with that knowledge comes responsibility. Not to become ruthless, but to become intentional. Not to harden your heart, but to guard it. Not to disappear, but to choose when and where you are visible. The goal was never to be feared. The goal was never to dominate. The goal is to become untouchable. Not emotionally, not psychologically, not strategically. Untouchable because you no longer give free access. Untouchable because your reactions are disciplined. Untouchable because your presence carries quiet authority. You don't announce this change. You don't explain it. You live it, and the silence explains everything. That is where real power begins. Not in noise, not in approval, not in validation, but in clarity, restraint, and self-command. And once you step into that, fully, you'll never wonder again why the kindest people suffer, because you won't be suffering anymore.